Just to say something about Mrs. Thatcher in the context of this class, because the last lecture will address her legacy specifically. But she was elected in 1979, and that date is often taken to mark the end of the system of social democracy that I've been talking to you about, that was established in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the displacement of social democracy with what became known as Thatcherism, or later was known as neoliberalism. As I think both the Specials song in 1981 and Kinnock's speech in 1983 indicates, it actually takes a considerably longer period of time for the Thatcher project to gel. And it's important to emphasize at this point, when even the New York Times is engaged in valedictory obituaries of her, that her influence and her effect were deeply contentious in Britain and remain so to these days, even though she's going to get a state funeral. So today's lecture is not about Margaret Thatcher. It is about basically the place of Britain's role in the world, and particularly the collapse of the British Empire, and where that story fits into an account of the development of social democracy, the formation and development of social democracy in the decades of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And very often, this image that you see before you, which is of the botched British invasion of the Suez Canal in 1956, is taken as the critical turning point in the story, not just of the collapse of British imperial influence in the world, but of its broader influence and role in the world. But what I'm going to try and do today is to say it's a little more complicated than that. And I'm going to talk to you about a series of different but related processes, such as the displacement of Britain by the United States as the world superpower, the end of Britain's imperial influence that begins to accelerate following the independence of India and the partition of Pakistan in 1947, and the creation of Britain as a multi-racial and multi-faith society that came as a consequence of that process of decolonisation. And then finally to look at Britain's relationship with Europe and the project of European integration more broadly. So let me begin by reminding you that in 1945, Britain was still a world superpower. And it was, of course, one of the big three nations represented at the Potsdam Conference in 1945. It got and continues to have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. And this prestige and visibility of Britain was in many ways a consequence of its perceived strength, given its central role in the defeat of Germany and its allies during the Second World War, but also the continuing power and reach of an empire that was, even after the independence of India in 1947, still covering a fifth of the world's territory. Indeed, in 1953, when Hillary intended to conquer Mount Everest, as you see celebrated in the Illustrated London News here, this was seen as, in many ways, a good illustration of the great commanding power of the British people and the British Empire, still engaged on manly conquering adventures. There's no question that Britain's prestige in the post-war global settlements was bolstered by its empire. And Britain continued to see itself as a bulwark between the US and the Soviet Union in the developing Cold War. Britain thought that its empire would give it a particular role to play as a counterpoint between this developing bipolar world. But as we'll see, what happens is that Britain increasingly becomes a client rather than simply an ally of the United States. And in important ways, that was a consequence of the financial ruin of the two world wars that Britain had fought in the space of 20 years. And the fact that, despite expectations, the British Empire did not come to rescue the country economically. Indeed, Britain became dependent upon US loans and dollars, and America used its financial and military power to help bolster the British Empire to counter the threats of the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and the continent of Africa. In other words, we have to understand the process of decolonisation of the British Empire in the context of the broader Cold War. We also have to understand that collapse of the British Empire on its own terms. And certainly the Second World War made it quite apparent that the British Empire was no longer invincible. In 1942, the fall of Singapore, the hands of Japanese troops, was considered to be a crushing military blow, and blow to the prestige of Britain's imperial army. And of course, the spread of colonial nationalism during and after the war, which culminated with independence, as I said, in India in 1947, but a whole series of other growing revolts against British rule in Southeast Asia and in Africa, as we'll see. All of these things made the maintenance of the British Empire increasingly expensive, especially given that the Indian army had long played an absolutely critical strategic role in the military defence of the British Empire. So decolonisation accelerates in the 1950s, and basically as that process takes hold, British horizons begin to be redirected towards European integration, again with American encouragement as their key ally in this developing European project. Now, the other key element of this class, as I've already said, is the way in which colonial migration, through this process of decolonisation, creates a new type of multiracial, multi-faith society in Britain. Now, that, in important ways, as we'll see, changes Britain's understanding of itself as a nation, transforms Britain's sense of its own national identity, but it also, I think, has a key role in the unravelling of social democracy itself in ways that I hope will become apparent by the end of the lecture. So let me talk first about Britain and its relationship with the good old US of A. In many ways, this story, I think, has to start in 1941. 1941 is a critical turning point in relations between Britain and America. It's, in a way, as I say here, the change of guard on the global stage between Britain and the US, because it's at this point that Britain's financial and military dependence upon the US becomes first apparent. Keynes described this as an absolutely transformative moment in which America was picking out the eyes of the British Empire. So even at the time, influential people like Keynes were aware of the deeply important nature of this moment. And it happened in three phases. It happened first in March with the signing of the Lend-Lease Agreement, which I've already talked to you about. It happened in August, as you see here, off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada, when Churchill and Roosevelt meet on the HMS Prince of Wales and sign the Atlantic Charter. An Atlantic Charter which cements the political alliance between Britain and America, but also is seen to, in some ways, constrain Churchill's hand. It commits Britain to a shared vision of freedom from want and of fear, and it also establishes the illegitimacy or the importance of independent sovereignty of nations, i.e. it is implicitly critical of the British Empire. Then finally, in December of 1941, a really important moment is the arrival of US troops on British soil, in order, obviously, to aid the Allied war effort against Germany and its allies, but for whom some people felt was the beginning of a type of military occupation. It's a moment when British sovereignty seems to be called into question. So 1941 is a key moment. It accelerates in the aftermath of the war with the continuing and deepening necessity or reliance of Britain upon American financial muscle. As I've already said, Britain has war debts of £22 billion in 1945. It loses a whole bunch of overseas investments during the war. It loses two-thirds of its exports, and it struggles with this enormous balance of payments deficit. So Keynes is again dispatched off to Washington in 1945 to beg loans from the American Treasury of £3.75 billion to try and make the pound convertible at $4 under the Bretton Woods system. In other words, to try and maintain the value of the pound as it had been in the so-called golden era of the gold standard before the First World War, and briefly again in the 1920s. There's then a second round of loans that develop in 1947 through the Marshall Plan, and then a third round of loans in 1950 when America loans Britain a further £145 million and a line of credit of $930 million. So Britain is basically the point that I'm trying to get here, and I've given you all of those figures before, I think, that Britain is financially increasingly structurally dependent on America. The other growing form of dependence of Britain on America was militarily. Now, Britain tried very hard in the post-war period to maintain its global role through its own defence expenditure. Indeed, one historian has recently argued that the post-war period should be better understood not as a welfare state system, but as a warfare state system. Defence expenditure, as you can see, grows, doubles from 2.6 to 5.8% of GDP in the 1940s and in the 1950s. And that growth is in many ways about the cost of maintaining the military capacities and military control of the British Empire. Because without that, Britain would lose a considerable amount of its global influence. The other key element of this, the growing expenditure on the defence industries, was, of course, the cost of the development of Britain's independent nuclear capacity, which, as you can see in this image, was tested on British colonial territories like Australia and several of the Pacific Islands as well. The independent nuclear capacity was meant to give Britain the type of military leverage and strategic role that the loss of the Indian Army had once played. Britain's military alliance with the US, of course, becomes cemented with the formation of NATO in 1949. But all that does is formalise a relationship that had already been well established, because after American troops arrived in Britain, the next thing that happened was American air bases were established in the UK in 1942, and those air bases are further developed in the post-war period, with two new bases at Lakenheath and Mildenhall in the 1950s, and of course also the base at Aldermaston, which becomes the site of protest by the people campaigning against the nuclear deterrent. Now, there's different dates for the time in which American nuclear missiles are sighted in Britain, but basically it happens some point in the middle of the 1950s. Effectively, it happens in 1954, and the formal agreement is actually signed in 1958. So here is, for many people, again, a key way in which the loss of sovereignty that Britain had by the sighting of military troops during the Second World War was now cemented and expanded in the post-war period. Imagine for a moment the idea that Canada or Mexico could sight their own troops and air stations on the territory of the United States. It's a considerable deviation from the idea of national sovereignty. Now, the other key moment here is, of course, the Suez Crisis in 1956. It's pretty clear that America is supporting Britain financially and militarily because the British Empire is still strategically important for the US in the conduct of the Cold War. What becomes clear in 1956 is that America is basically calling the shots. And so the great contrast is between the American support of the British counter-insurgency techniques in Malaya, where it's trying to put down a nationalist revolt in which communists are playing a role, and therefore is a key bridgehead for the US to try and keep communism out of Southeast Asia, and Egypt. In 1952 in Egypt, Nasser, the nationalist leader, replaces King Farouk, who was basically a client of Britain. Remember, Egypt had been part of the British Empire since 1882 and through to the 1920s. In 1954, NASA orders the withdrawal of British troops from Egyptian soil, and in 1956, in part as retaliation, Britain and the US cancel a big dam contract for the construction of a dam project in Egypt. And in response, NASA takes control of the Suez Canal, which had long been the strategically hugely important for British trade and shipping to have access to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Anthony Eden, the leader of the Conservative Party, collaborates with France, which of course also had imperial interest in Egypt, to try and reopen the canal, to try and basically recolonize the canal, and America withdraws its support for that effort. And Britain and France are left basically high and dry and have to withdraw in defeat. It's a major humiliation for Britain. Anthony Eden resigns from office and is succeeded immediately by a new Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. Now, all of this meant that there was a growing political anti-Americanism developing in Britain. We've seen already in the 1920s and 1930s a growing suspicion, distrust, and dislike of American mass culture. What we see happening in the 1950s is a sharpening of that anti-American critique and its expression in new political forms. And there are really two examples of that. The first is the Keep Left group, which was a group within the Labour Party, headed by Michael Foot and Crossman, that wanted Britain to maintain a non-aligned position, i.e. to break free of its relationship with the United States. The other key organisation was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which was campaigning not just against the removal of American missiles nuclear missiles from British soil, but the removal of the abandonment of Britain's nuclear deterrent. But it provided a key outlet for people's criticisms of the sighting of American military nuclear missiles on British soil, a debate that continued for decades. Okay, let me move on to the complicated process of decolonisation. Now, people often speak of various phases of the British Empire. The first British Empire is often thought to run up to the War of Independence in 1776. The second British Empire, therefore, is the moment when British imperialism reorientates itself to Asia and becomes orientated around the idea of an empire of trade. The third British Empire, which is a term that some historians use to talk about the recalibration of the British imperial mission at some point after the First World War. And people would argue about whether it begins after 1918 and 1919 with the mandates, or whether we can think of it as beginning after 1945. Doesn't seem to me to be so important when it is that you choose a starting date, than you realise that it distinguishes a different type of character of British imperialism, and that's really what it's trying to get at. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are basically three elements to this new character of British imperialism in this period: political, cultural, and economic. So the political project first. After the Second World War, the British Empire is rebranded as a Commonwealth of Nations. A Commonwealth of Nations that can include formal colonies and colonies that have gained independence, either as dominions or as their own republics. But the story of the development of the idea of a Commonwealth of Nations begins much earlier. It begins, in fact, in the 1890s, when people begin to argue for the idea of a Greater Britain of the white settler colonies that became dominions shortly afterwards. There were imperial conferences that were part of the development of this idea, in which the South African leader, Jan Christian Smuts, first coined the term, this Commonwealth of Nations, in 1917. And this idea of the Commonwealth we see also threaded through the Statutes of Westminster in 1931 that I talked to you about several weeks ago. The idea here was that the dominions, the so-called white dominions of Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and even Ireland after 1922, would get, in return for their continuing political relationship with Britain, or in return for their independence, I should say, closer economic and cultural ties with the so-called motherland. So let me look at what those cultural and economic ties were. A key part of this effort was the idea of being able to maintain a British world, an Anglo world of influence. And culture was seen to be an important part of that project. The idea was to spread British influence culturally through the dissemination of films and books and plays and radio broadcasts and so forth. In many ways, we can see the beginning of this process with the formation of the Empire Press Union in 1909, the Empire Press Union, which was established to facilitate the exchange of news between across the British Empire. But we've also seen it in the creation of the Empire Marketing Board in 1926, and then and the Colonial Film Unit in 1939. But I think really the two most critical organisations that you should focus on are the British Empire, the BBC Empire Service, which we now know as the BBC World Service, and the formation, which was formed in 1932, and the British Council, which is formed in 1934. Now, the British Empire Service gets renamed in 1939 the Overseas Service, and it quickly begins to focus upon the broadcasting in foreign languages, the promotion of British news in indigenous languages. By 1945, it was broadcasting in Arabic, in Afrikaans, in Bengali, in Gujarati, in Marathi, in Hindi, in Tamil, in Persian, in Thai, in Malay, in Mandarin and Cantonese, as well as Japanese. Okay, this was a major projection of British cultural influence across the world. It also broadcast in all European languages. So this wasn't simply about trying to maintain British influence in the colonial world. It was a globally conceived project. The other area that I think is really new and important was the growing economic ties, or the restructuring of the economic ties of the British Empire project. And I talked to you already about the creation of the sterling area in 1931 when Britain comes off the gold standard.